The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local journalism today at chly.ca/donate. Local news doesn't survive without local support.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. As BC gets ready to spring forward one final time, a number of voices are saying the government has ignored the scientific consensus on how to best handle getting rid of time changes. The BC government press release on the adoption of permanent daylight time cited a study from Standford Medicine on the impacts of clock changes. The senior author of that study told the CBC that permanent daylight time is scientifically not a good idea. That sentiment is echoed by Camosun psychology instructor Michael Pollock, who says a move toward permanent standard time would be the better option from a public health perspective if the province was looking to do away with time changes. I spoke with Pollock Thursday.
So hi, I'm Dr. Michael Pollock from Department of Psychology at Camosun College, Victoria.
And what do you make of the move to permanent daylight savings time?
Yeah, so the sleep researchers for a long time have been wanting to get rid of the transition, but the problem is that which way the government has chosen to do the transition, to which time to go permanently, is the opposite of what the sleep and circadian researchers have been saying for years to do. The government, BC government, has just announced that we're switching to permanent daylight savings time. So daylight savings time was only meant to be done in the summertime when the days are longer. It was never designed for the winter time. And the sleep circadian experts say that it'll be disastrous to have that in the winter time. That standard time, which is the original time, is the better option to have year round if you're going to get rid of the transitions back and forth.
Now, in a press release about this decision, the government cited 2019 research that suggested more than 90% of British Columbians surveyed were in favor of the move to permanent daylight time over changing the clocks. Now, that survey did not ask about a move to standard time at all. It wasn't even part of the consideration. I asked the government about that, and they suggested, well, at the time when we did this research, other places were looking at maybe moving to daylight time, and we wanted to be in sync with them. Now we don't really care as much in the case of the United States as about being in sync, so we've just gone ahead and made the move to daylight time. What do you make of that situation?
Yeah, I'm glad that you know your facts there about that survey, how they didn't give the option for permanent standard time, which the sleep researchers have been saying for a long time that we should be doing. So yeah, I don't, in terms of which way they chose that, citing that past poll only just says that people do want to get rid of the transition back and forth every year. But yeah, and I totally agree with your consensus too, that, so I know my colleagues at SFU and UBC, back when John Horgan first proposed in 2019 after receiving results from that survey to get rid of the transition and was saying to do permanent daylight savings time, all my colleagues, sleep researcher experts, wrote a letter to him saying, no, that's not what all the sleep professional societies are saying to do, that we should go with permanent standard time. And unfortunately, it seemed like their words just fell on deaf ears, that the politicians at the time didn't listen. And it sounds like the same situation now, that it's not being listened to. Ironically, one thing just to note, that in the BC government news on their website, where they released on Monday this announcement that they've chosen to go with permanent daylight savings time, that they provide one link to back up the health effects of their decision. And it's a link to a Standford medical report. And if you actually click on it, read it, it actually says in clear terms that the healthier option for most people is to go with permanent standard time, not what the government chose to do. So, yeah, a little bit ironic. Their own link argues against which direction they chose.
Can you dive a little more into the detail for me as to why you're suggesting that the scientists' consensus on this is that standard time would be the healthier option?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah. So, I mean, the most obvious kind of thing when people think about why you don't want to have daylight savings time in the winter when the days are short is that it'll lead to mornings artificially darkened. So this has been done in the past a few times, even though daylight saving time was never designed for the winter, but it's been attempted before in the States. In 1974, Nixon passed an act to have daylight saving time all year round, including in the winter. And people hated it because they had to go to school and work in the dark, take their kids to have them walk to school in the dark. And after 1 year of that, people rebelled, and by that point, Nixon had kicked out. But Gerald Ford got rid of it and went back to the transitioning back and forth every year. More recently, Russia in 2011 and 2014, they also attempted it too. They went to permanent daylight savings time all year round, including the winter. And again, people rebelled. They complained about it, having to go to school and work in the dark. And the Russian government actually listened to the people and changed it. In 2014, they got rid of it, went to permanent standard time. So yeah, if history is any indicator, then this coming winter that we'll have to learn the hard way that the winter time when the days are short, you don't want to be having the daylight saving time then where it forces us to wake up an hour earlier in the dark. Now that's kind of usually what often people point to. Actually there's even a more severe reason why you don't want to have daylight saving time in the winter, which gets a little bit complicated. But essentially, the idea for this is that our brains have a biological clock called circadian clock that tells your rest of your brain when to wake up and go to sleep on a roughly 24-hour rhythm. So that even if you're stuck in a cave for days on end with no cues as to when the sun is up and when it's down, you'll still wake up and go to sleep on roughly 24-hour rhythms. But our rhythms aren't precise. It's a little bit off. For most people on average, it's about 12 minutes longer. So what you'll see of those people in the caves, that the longer they're in there, the more they'll drift way out of sync from outside time. And the only thing that normally keeps us in sync with the outside world is primarily sunlight and morning sunlight. That's the only thing that keeps our clocks in check from drifting later and later each day. So here's the problem, is that here in Victoria and Nanaimo, that in the wintertime, the sun currently in our standard time that we had last winter, the sun doesn't rise until about 8 in the morning. Now with this new legislation's passed this upcoming winter, the sun won't rise until about 9 in the morning. So not only does that mean that most people are going to be commuting to and from work in the dark, but also it means that the only thing that keeps our clock in check won't be happening until 9 a.m. So that's our internal biological clock in our brain. The only thing that kind of tells it when to wake up is that sunrise. So it'll be thinking all winter long that we shouldn't be up so early, that we shouldn't be waiting until about 9 a.m. to be waking up. And so that'll be really problematic, especially for young people, adolescents and young adults, where their brains are already, telling them they should be sleeping in and staying up late, so-called night owls. And so they will be really strongly affected. I'm predicting that they will have extra hard time waking up that extra hour earlier in the dark all winter long. And they'll have social jet lag, that their attention levels throughout the day will be affected. They'll have a hard time going to bed at night, so the sleep will be disrupted. So it'll just be a chronic kind of thing that we'll see for most of the winter, unfortunately, is what I'm predicting.
It's my understanding that the Yukon made this change circa around 2020, and I'm wondering if that situation is maybe a counterpoint to some of those other examples that made the change and then there was this backlash and they went away. There hasn't seemed to be a backlash that's filtered its way to the local news here.
Yeah, so up in the Yukon, in the wintertime, their days are incredibly short. The further away you get from the equator, the more extreme variations you get in day length, in the winter versus summer. So whereas I said here in Victoria and Nanaimo, previously in our standard time that in the winter, the sun rises about 8 in the morning, there, the sun doesn't rise until 11 in the morning and much shorter time period. So their winter's already so out of whack. There's, shifting an hour one direction or another isn't going to affect much to begin with. So, and it is very difficult if for anyone who's lived in these northern climates, and I've talked to them, it's very hard to adapt. You're going to work in the dark, you're in school and you're leaving in the dark. And so they have a lot of mental health issues in the wintertime as a result of that.
That has to do with how far north or south a place is. What about how far east or west a place is? How is this change going to affect different places in British Columbia differently on an east-west kind of axis?
Yeah, so if you're looking at the really extreme east of BC, if we're talking about like Fernie, that they're really close that, to Alberta. And so in our with this new legislation in the winter, that having daylight savings time here in the Pacific will essentially be on Alberta time. The Mountain Standard Time is assuming that they still keep Standard Time. It sounds like they might switch to daylight saving time too, but at least for next winter, it looks like that, we'll during the wintertime, we'll have the same time as them. So the fact that they're so far east, Fernie in BC, and they get the sun, about half an hour earlier than here on the island, the sunrise, that they won't be as affected. And in fact, a lot of areas on the eastern side of BC that there's some small pockets that have always just kept on closer to Alberta time, the Mountain Standard Time. There's a few exceptions that have been out there. Whereas, the ones that are further west will have more extreme kind of effects of the time change.
And it's my understanding that as of now, the intention is for some of those eastern communities to perhaps continue to make the switch, and or the understanding that the local governments in those places will have the power to determine what time zone they observe.
That's right. Yeah, they have included that in the BC government news legislation, the ability for those areas still to decide locally, what to do.
Is there something about maybe just like a shift in our society or the way things work such that we're talking about making permanent daylight time the norm, and maybe, I don't know, like maybe people are waking up later on average or something that has factored into the calculus here, you think?
In terms of the government's decision, and there's been similar proposals in the States. Like I think Marco Rubio, I can't remember the specific year, if it was 2016, but he proposed the Sunshine Protection Act, which is essentially the idea of having permanent daylight saving time all year round. Now, of course, he proposed that before he became Secretary of State when he was a senator of Florida. And Florida is so south, close to the equator, that the differences in the winter and summer doesn't vary that much in terms of day length. So the shift won't have as large a problem for them in terms of making them have to go to school and work in the dark and having delayed sunrise. But it seems why they propose this is kind of the name itself. It's a selling point. They get caught in this, this name of daylight savings time. When you hear that, who wouldn't want to save more daylight? And you get the popular opinion of it gives us extra recreational sunlight after work hours, and that is true for in the summertime. Daylight savings time, its original intention was proposed in the early 1900s. Of course, it didn't actually get passed legislation in countries for that purpose. It was more for saving energy, which doesn't really apply in today's society, where we have much more energy efficient lighting with LED systems. But that idea, though, in the summertime, daylight savings time, that is true how it was designed, that when the days were already longer and we tend to sleep in and miss sunrise that was earlier, to get us to force to wake up an hour earlier so we can capture more of that morning daylight and have longer days. So when we get out of work, there's more sunlight for playing golf and other outdoor recreations. And again, I'm hearing our politicians, Premier Eby, make that kind of argument. One, he said, get rid of the transition, which everyone finds annoying. But then he says, then we can have an extra hour of sunlight after work in the wintertime. But actually, if you think about it, it doesn't quite work out. So here in Victoria and Nanaimo and Vancouver, in the wintertime, as I mentioned, that typically in our last winter, in standard time, the sun rises at 8 in the morning and it sets about 4:30, 4:20-ish in the evening throughout most of the winter time. And with this change, now with this legislation of a daylight saving time in the upcoming winter, then instead the sun won't set until about 5:30, maybe a little bit less than that. For most of the winter. And so if you think about the typical work hours, most people in the office work from 9 to 5. Then, yeah, when they get out of work, there will be sunlight there, but it'll only last for probably half an hour most. Most of that sunlight they'll get in drive and commuting home, and it's at the sacrifice of being in the darkness on their drive to and from to school or work in the morning. And I'm not sure how much of it will be able to be spent recreation because you'll be driving. It'll also cold in the wintertime. So the whole promise of having a whole extra hour of sunlight with this change next coming winter, I just don't see how it's practical. And even kind of to push the argument further, well, if the whole idea is all you care about is getting more after work fun sunlight time in the winter, and you don't care about sacrificing that morning sunlight, then you could kind of push that argument. Well, why only 1 hour? Why don't we wake up several hours earlier in the wintertime in the dark, spend most of our work day in the dark, and then after work we have the majority of our day's sunlight happen after work for fun recreational time. When you think about that, you see the flaw in the argument that, well, then you're really talking about shift work. And you have all the problems with shift work for that when you get out of sync with the day night cycle, that it causes all sorts of problems.
Midcoast Morning is part of our nonprofit newsroom project, supported by listeners like you. Keep this program on the air by funding it today with a monthly sustaining donation at chly.ca/donate. We've got tote bags and shirts if you need an incentive.
BC's government says recent US actions have changed its thinking, emboldening the province to go ahead alone with an idea that has its political roots in the US. The province announced this week it was adopting permanent daylight savings time. It cited overwhelming support for the measure based on a 2019 survey that asked whether people favored keeping twice-yearly time changes or switching to permanent daylight time. That survey did not have an option in support of permanent standard time, which BC's Ministry of the Attorney General says was because it was not thought of as a viable option at the time, because standard time was not being considered by any of BC's neighbouring jurisdictions. Michael Pollock of Camosun College argues that permanent standard time would be the better option from a public health standpoint. I'm speaking with him on today's program. It is a very common refrain, though, to hear people lamenting in the wintertime the fact that the sun is going to set before 5 p.m. and perhaps now celebrating the fact that it will not. What would you say to those people?
Yeah, that I think, it sounds nice to get a little bit extra sunlight on your leaving home. Although, as I said, the history has shown before that having the mornings artificially darkened, not having the sun rise until 9 a.m. instead of having it at 8 a.m. and throughout most of the winter time, that is, people have historically, when that has been tried a few times, people just hate it and realize how terrible it is, not only because of the complete darkness of going to school and work, but also as this sleep researchers have said, the really chronic effect it'll have all winter long on our biological clock. We'll have what's called social jet lag. We'll just be in this funk, this brain fog throughout the winter. And as I said, yeah, mostly the young people will be the ones that are most affected by that.
Could we just sort of shift the hours we had to work at certain jobs or something? Or it sounds to me like the most universally acknowledged impact of this will probably be on schools and children at schools, and that there is a big part of this that means for not just a day or two, but that students will be going to school in the dark. Is there something we could do about that beyond the time change itself?
Yeah. I mean, as all the sleep researchers say, is standard time would be the best. That way we'd be getting that morning sunlight earlier so that our biological clocks in our brain are telling us to wake up earlier and we're not fighting impulses to sleep in. And then if you want to have extra sunlight after work, that perhaps people could arrange to leave work early. It doesn't have to be all society that has to be on this system that affects all schools and such like that. That would be the ideal for those people that really want to capture more sunlight after 5 p.m. That if they could schedule to leave work early, maybe those people, they'd be willing to make the sacrifice to get to work earlier, and adjust for that. But to have this blanket kind of all of BC now has to wake up and go to school and work in the dark. Yeah, it's terrible for a number of reasons, and especially the sleep circadian reasons.
We addressed this a little bit earlier on, but the Ministry of the Attorney General, in response to questions, essentially said that BC is doing this because we were considering doing this and people liked it. And they said that they were considering doing this because this was what everyone, U.S. states or the Yukon, this is what everyone was considering doing. Do we have a sense of why this is the thing that everyone was considering doing in the first place, the move to daylight time?
Yeah, as I mentioned, that the former Florida Senator Marco Rubio was the one that was really pushing for this Sunshine Protection Act, essentially this permanent daylight saving time all year round. But wasn't most places in our to the south of us, the California, Washington, Oregon, that they haven't been able to pass it, and that's what previously John Horgan, he delayed and waited, and Premier Eby was also delaying until, as you mentioned, the more recent kind of politics clashes with the states, where now he decided not to wait any longer. But presumably the reason why they haven't been able to pass it is because some of the politicians there have actually listened to the scientists. Not all, but realized it would be a bad idea to have that daylight saving time, that summertime all year round. It was just never designed to be had in the short day length of winter time. And so I guess that's why they haven't been able to pass it in the States. Yeah, unfortunately, that our government decided to just go ahead anyways and not be listened to what the scientists have been saying.
But is it really is your best understanding that Marco Rubio was trying to get something done in the U.S. Senate? Is that really at the root of it?
Yeah, that seemed to be the big push that started in the States. The movement to try to have permanent daylight savings time, and then that seemed to catch wind here in Canada as well amongst politicians. And again, it sounds nice, that the name itself is so selling. Daylight savings time. We want to save time. We want to have extra sunlight after work hours. But yeah, for all those reasons I said before, just the underlying biology of it, it's a terrible idea to have in the winter here. In Florida, it wouldn't make a difference. Their time that in the winter time there, the sun rises, I think, 7 in the morning for most of the winter. So if they had permanent daylight savings time in the winter, then the sun would rise at around 8 in the morning. Well, still, if they leave at 8 to go to commute to school or work, they're still getting sunlight. Then it's not as bad as it would be up here in Canada. And of course, as I mentioned, the further north you go, then the later the sunrise tends to be, and the more problem you have if you're delaying even further with having daylight saving time in the winter.
So is it fair to read between the lines in your argument and suggest that it sounds like for you, Nanaimo and Victoria specifically are in a bit of a sweet spot where you feel like having the sunrise after 9 a.m. is in this zone where it would have particularly negative impacts, whereas in other places it might not be such a big deal?
Yeah, so I mean, we're very similar. Most of the large cities in Canada are all along the southern kind of border of Canada. A lot of large populations. There are ones further north, and again, the further north you go, the more struggling they're having in the wintertime. A lot of the in the States, a lot of the populations on the on the East Coast are towards the north, and they're not too different from us. They're kind of in the same boat, which is why I imagine in that 1974, when there was the complaints when they tried to have the daylight savings time all year round, that it didn't come from Texas or Florida. I'm guessing it must have come from more of those large populations that are close to us in terms of their latitude, how far north they are, and they would have all that kind of darkness of going to school and work at that time point.
What are you going to be watching for the first time the clocks don't fall back in the fall and in maybe the year or so after that?
Yeah, I think that it'll be continuous because we won't have the abrupt change to time, which is nice not to have to abrupt change. Although at the fall, you get the benefit. That's the time you get to sleep in. That's the actual one fun time of the transition. It's the springtime we're having this coming Sunday, where we lose an hour of sleep by springing the clocks ahead. That's always the awful time. And where we just right now, the sun is rising just before 7 after the Sunday. Then like for next Monday, then the sun won't rise until 8 in the morning. It won't be until April that we get back to having sunlight at 7 in the morning. So I always miss that. I like waking up and having the sunlight right away. And as I said, it's so nice for the clock, but it'll be even worse. Yeah, that when we get into the December and January months, where then the sun isn't rising until 9 in the morning. And as I said, going to school and work in the dark, it's what I'm calling MAD. It's MAD, mornings artificially darkened. We'll notice it then, and also all those circadian effects that will really produce, especially for the younger individuals, the adolescents and young adults, that terrible kind of social jet lag. They'll experience it the most, I'm guessing.
Michael Pollock is a psychology instructor at Camosun College in Victoria. Following up on a detail from that conversation, evidence suggests that there was in fact backlash to permanent daylight time in Florida in the 1970s. An article in the Bradenton Herald from the period says that after daylight time went into effect on January 6, 1974 in the United States as an energy-saving measure, 8 children were reported killed in traffic accidents in a 3-week span compared to 2 in the same period the previous year. Unlike in that scenario, there would be no wintertime clock change in BC, and dark mornings would arrive more gradually. Midcoast Morning reached out to the province about the time change and were referred to the Ministry of the Attorney General, who were unable to accommodate an interview when asked about the decision to shift to daylight time as opposed to standard time. The ministry said via email that in 2019, none of BC's neighbouring jurisdictions were considering a move to standard time, and it was therefore not considered a viable option. It said recent actions have shifted how BC approaches decisions that merit alignment with the United States, including on time changes. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and RB Fruit is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, you can email us at news@chly.ca. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. That's all for now. We'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
This program gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.